May Day in Paris has been more about expressing opposition to President Emmanuel Macron than a celebration of the rights of workers. The government authorized a massive police presence and gave them unprecedented powers to initiate violence. Rami Mazari has our details out of Paris.
On International Workers' Day, Paris truly resembled a city under foreign occupation. Protests were banned across entire regions of Paris. Hundreds of shops were ordered to be shuttered and barricaded, and a police force of unparalleled size was deployed. Starting from a radius extending at least 150 kilometers around the capital, rural gendarmes made warrantless searches at toll booths and highway checkpoints. Inside Paris, police unveiled a new tactic, repeatedly dividing the demonstration into smaller, more manageable groups, even though that required initiating violence against protesters to stop them from marching peacefully. Countless May Day demonstrators were hurt by rubber bullets, tear gas, water cannons, and police batons, and hundreds were arrested in Paris alone.
The government doesn't know what to do because they see that the movement continues despite so much repression. We will not stop until we get the right to citizen-initiated referendums, the end to corporate tax evasion, and policies based on social justice so that people can live decently.
Hundreds of thousands of people marched across the nation, mainly to show their rejection of President Emmanuel Macron. At his first ever press conference last week, where he publicly said the words "yellow vests" for the first time ever, he unveiled a series of proposals designed to placate the yellow vest movement, which is nearing its 6th-month anniversary. Polls show that nearly 65% of France said they were not convinced by Macron's speech.
Macron has ended so much social assistance to poor people. He tells lies about the poor and also about his own policies. We are sick of his policies and must finish the Macron era. We demand more aid for poor people, such as myself.
The same poll showed that 80% believe that the Yellow Vest anti-government movement will continue, and analysts say that May 1st will probably mark the beginning of a new baseline for political repression in France. With the obvious rejection of Macron's proposed solutions, there seems to be no political pathway to resolve the long-running crisis. France looks set to alternate between massive state repression and Yellow Vest revolution for the many weeks and months to come. Ramin Mazaheri, Press TV, Paris.
Now joining us for this news review is Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, joining us out of Bristol, and Edward Corrigan, international lawyer, joining us out of Ontario. Gentlemen, I want to thank you both for joining us on the program. Now, Tony, I'm going to start with you. 6 months and counting. What's it going to take? I mean, why haven't these protests abated?
The reason is because the French have a very long tradition and an honourable tradition of when their government is corrupt coming out onto the streets. This has been happening actually on and off for hundreds of years, as we know, beginning really with the French Revolution and the overthrowing of the French monarchy. The thing is that I would disagree with your correspondent there, saying that this May Day is not about workers' rights anymore. Actually, this is exactly why people are on the streets, is to back those workers' rights and to make an absolutely really difficult situation for the government, because those rights are being eroded, are being taken away. In a way, it's a celebration on the streets because the French do this. This is what they do, and they will make sure that the government is finding it more and more difficult to govern the country until the government starts to behave itself. What we're seeing instead, of course, is a police state beginning to roll out, and that is becoming clearer and clearer for many people right across France and across Europe and the United States to a lesser extent, because the media hasn't really been in the West reporting this very well, and certainly not reporting the context in which it's happening. In other words, the reasons. The big question the Western journalists seem to be afraid to ask is, why are people out on the streets? So the repression that Macron is bringing at the moment actually brings recruitment for the yellow vests. As he attacks the poor and more people have sympathy with the protesters and more of the poor come out onto the streets, I'm afraid Macron's solutions, as he puts them forward, are becoming more and more obvious that they're not solutions at all. And so as the police start to charge in, as they get more and more heavy-handed, you will find more and more people coming out onto the streets in France. They're not likely to back away. That this sort of police state action and repression just simply brings more out onto the streets. So it'll be very interesting to see if we have a French Spring rather like the Arab Spring we had a decade or so ago.
And Edward, if I could swing over to you now, your thoughts on these protests and what Tony was alluding to, how authorities are dealing with them.
Actually, I agree with the previous speaker. France does have a long tradition of activism. It has a strong socialist movement, even communist party, and the media in France has got different newspapers which cover the issues from different perspectives. There's Libération, there's Le Monde Diplomatique. So you have left-wing papers that have a large following, and it's not all papers that are controlled by a corporate elite with a very, very narrow right-wing economic agenda. So you have diverse opinions. And the polls show that actually a majority of French people support the yellow vests, 53%, which is a good sign that Macron's policies are working. Now, there is a tradition that when there's protests like this and the government overextends itself, usually at the next election they get punished and they're thrown out and you end up having a new government brought in. So Macron is probably aware of this and also fearful of it. Initially, he was trying to placate the protesters and he backed off the gas tax, but he refused to reduce the tax reductions that he was giving the very wealthy. And this is one of the things that sparked the uprising on the street, where people were saying that Macron's not representing the French people. He's only representing the narrow economic elite that he is seen as part of. So this is part of the backlash. This has been going on now for 25 weeks. You've got thousands of demonstrators going all over the country. In fact, it's even spreading to other European countries. And so initially Macron wanted to sort of try to come up with some sort of compromise, but that hasn't worked. Now he's relying upon the police, even threatening to bring in the army. But some of the elements of the army and stuff are not supportive of the government's repression. And in fact, they have refused to use these rubber bullets that have blinded people and injured people, and which are widely condemned as being inappropriate use of force.
Now, Tony, how come we didn't see this? Because there's austerity during Hollande's tenure. How come we didn't see these protests of this scale and the level during Hollande, and now Macron's in office? We're seeing it weekly.
As a socialist, Hollande was much more measured about bringing in the austerity program, very slow, and also he was not giving the massive tax breaks to the rich and taking away literally bread money from the poor. This is what Macron has done, and this is why I think we're also, there is a much bigger picture if we just take a step back for a moment from everything we can see what's happening in France right now. If you go back to the 1990s, we had the IMF structural adjustment programs. The poorer countries in the world were being robbed of their infrastructure by the IMF. That then starts to roll out into the developed world, and those countries are also countries like here in Britain and other countries in Europe started privatizing much of their state infrastructure. And then we had, in the 2010s, this Arab Spring, as I said, the revolutions in Ukraine, these kinds of civil wars breaking out. Let me tell you, I think this is actually what is beginning to happen. We've got the early signs of it in Europe now, that the people in Europe are being subjected to the same sorts of economic warfare policies against the population that have been happening in Africa and Ukraine and other countries in the previous 10 years. Mervyn King, the former Bank of England governor, recently said that there's a £144 trillion debt overhang that cannot be paid. He's predicting a 1929 style mega crash in the euro-dollar world as well. So these are the background, the economic mismanagement, deliberate mismanagement, the robbing of the poor by the rich in the West, which is starting to actually have an effect on the streets. And it's not surprising that the French have been the first to have these mass, well-organized protests, because they're simply not having it. They can see, in their own homes, with their own friends, their own family, finding it almost impossible to feed their family, to pay the rent and these sorts of things, and they're simply not going to put up with it. And the other question involved in all this is, why is there no halt to privatisation in France? Why, again, in Britain, is there no Brexit? And that is because the other country where there's been a lot of protests that spun off from the Yellow Vests is in Brussels. And one of the demands of the Yellow Vests is to leave the European Union. Europe is in the throes now of just having European elections. Are we going to be electing a new president of Europe? No. Manfred Weber will be the next president of Europe. It looks like almost certainly, but he won't be elected. So there's a total lack of democracy in Europe. Although we have elections, we don't get to elect the top people in the European Union. So what's the point in those elections, many people would say, and that's why when you have no democracy, people come out on the streets as they're doing in France.
Interesting points. And Mr. Corrigan, I'm going to let you get the last word in, sir. What's it going to take for there seems to be a disconnect between the working class and Emmanuel Macron. What's going to take for these people to say, okay, right on, this guy can relate to me, I can relate to him, this is my president?
Well, the massive tax cuts he gave the rich created such a huge uproar in France because they don't have money for poor people, for education. The poor and even the middle class are being very much under economic attack. Yet he has unlimited money for the wealthy. There is unlimited money for wars of aggression against, Syria, against, Libya, and they have money there, but don't have money for the people. And I think also what sort of fanned the flames is that they instantly came up with $1 billion to rebuild Notre Dame. But, when they say they've got no money for the poor and no money for this, and we have to give tax cuts to the rich and the corporations will pay little or no tax, and then they say we got nothing for the poor, and then you say, oh, we got $1 billion we have to rebuild. It's one thing to rebuild Notre Dame, which I think is probably a good idea, but it's another thing to say, sorry, we have money for this, we got money for wars, but we don't have money for people, for education. We're not going to raise the minimum wage. We're going to increase gas taxes, which punish the poor in general, and of course to throw sort of gasoline on the fire were these massive tax cuts for the rich. Now, one other point I'd like to make is that a lot of the violence in countries like this, quite often it's the police that go in and create violence in order for a pretext to delegitimize the protesters, and then, of course, to use more violence to suppress them. This has been a pretty common pattern across the world, and it's a way of delegitimizing things, and it's often the police or some anarchists are sent in to do this, to cause problems, to justify a brutal police crackdown. And this may not always be the case, but in many cases it is. So I think we have to be very careful when we look at the violences and it's used as an excuse and pretext to suppress political and democratic rights and to use violence against peaceful protesters. So I think that's something we have to keep our eye on as well.
Gentlemen, we're way over time, but it was a pleasure having both of you on. Good stuff. Thank you for joining us. Tony Gosling and Edward Corrigan, Bristol and Ontario, respectively. Thank you much. And viewers, that's a wrap for this segment of your Press TV's News Review. Thank you for tuning in, and bye-bye for now.